Hi, my name is Alara. I was 18 the night my father told me I wasn't his problem anymore. No warning, no discussion, just a suitcase on the porch and the front door closing behind me like a period at the end of a sentence I didn't get to finish. I remember the streetlight flickering above, casting a shaky shadow on the pavement as I stood there in disbelief. It wasn't raining, but I felt soaked, like the entire world had pressed itself down on me in silence. I didn't cry. Not then. I just stared at the house I had grown up in, its windows dark and cold, and I told myself I'd never come back. I didn't mean never physically. I meant never like a ghost, never like someone begging to be let back in. He had made it clear family was a title you earned by being useful, and I had stopped being useful to him the moment my mother died. Before that night, I had still believed in slivers of love. I thought maybe the distance between us was just grief wrapped in silence. But when he shoved the keys into my hand and said, "Figure it out," I finally understood. Some fathers only love control. And when control slips, so does affection. I slept in a friend's car that night. She didn't know. I told her I had other plans. The seat was cold, and the engine made weird noises every few hours. I hugged my backpack like it could hug me back, and closed my eyes pretending I was in a movie. The kind where the main character hits rock bottom, but doesn't break. Just waits for the story to shift. It took 2 years before things even started shifting. I worked at a gas station during the day and took online courses at night using the free Wi-Fi from the laundromat next door. I kept my grades up, applied for scholarships, and ignored the ache that settled in my chest every time I saw a father hug his daughter. I didn't have time for pain. I only had space for strategy. I got a job at a startup after graduation. Customer support at first, then project assistant, then full-time marketing analyst within a year. I kept my head down and learned everything I could, staying late, showing up early, saying yes to everything and everyone. I had nothing to fall back on, so failure wasn't a fear. It was a forbidden option. I didn't look back, not until the day I signed the deed to a mansion in the same suburb my father still lived in. It wasn't on purpose. I swear it wasn't. The house had been listed as a private sale, and the location had only been revealed during the final walkthrough. But when I pulled up and saw the street name, something in my chest pulled tight. And when I saw the mailbox next door, still painted the same chipped blue, I stopped breathing for a second. That was his house. The same one that had exhaled me into the world like smoke. It looked smaller now, the lawn overgrown, the porch sagging slightly. I wanted to feel something. Anger, satisfaction, maybe even pride. But I only felt tired. Tired of holding old emotions like they were mine to carry forever. I bought the house anyway. Not because of him. Because it was beautiful. A wraparound porch, white shutters, hardwood floors that had been polished like memory. The kitchen smelled faintly of lemons and cedar, like someone had tried to scrub away a past. It felt like a new chapter, and I was ready to write it with quiet hands. For the first month, I didn't see him. Maybe he didn't recognize me. Maybe he didn't care. But on the 32nd day of living there, I caught a glimpse of him in the driveway. He was thinner, slower, dragging a bag of trash with more effort than I remembered. He glanced over once, his eyes narrowing. And then he looked away like I was a stranger selling religion door to door. I went inside without saying a word. Not because I was scared, but because I was still deciding who I wanted to be around him. The girl he kicked out, or the woman he'd have to watch succeed from his window. 3 weeks later, a letter showed up in my mailbox. No stamp, just folded and slipped under the lid. It wasn't an apology. It was a request. Would you consider helping me with some home repairs? Roof leaks. Things are falling apart. No name. No love, Dad. Just 7 lines of plain ink and silent pride. I stared at it for a long time. I could have thrown it away. I could have called the city inspector and let them deal with it. But something in me cracked, not forgiveness, not sympathy, just a kind of echo that sounded like my mother's voice. She would have wanted me to at least check. I walked over that afternoon, knocked once, twice. No answer. I was about to turn back when the door creaked open. He looked older up close. Hair thinner. Wrinkles deeper. eyes like glass left too long in the sun. He didn't smile. He just stepped aside and let me in. The house smelled like dust and sour coffee. The ceiling in the kitchen had a brown stain spreading like a bruise. I walked slowly, noting the cracks in the walls, the peeling paint, the quiet hum of loneliness that buzzed in corners. He didn't explain why he never fixed anything before. I didn't ask. We were two ghosts passing in a hallway where memories used to live. That day turned into 3 more. Then a week. I called a contractor, paid for it myself. He didn't thank me. Not properly. But he started leaving a cup of tea on my porch every morning, lukewarm and half-sweetened. It was the closest he came to saying anything kind. And maybe that's why I didn't stop it when the visits became regular. I told myself it was just neighborly. But sometimes I caught him watching from his window as I watered my plants or carried in groceries, and the look on his face wasn't hatred or regret. It was something deeper. Maybe envy. Maybe confusion. Maybe both. Then the night came when he didn't return home. I noticed because his lights stayed off longer than usual and the tea didn't appear on my porch. At first, I didn't care. Then I remembered the soft cough I'd heard him struggling with the last few days. I walked over and knocked. No answer. A part of me hoped he was just ignoring me again, retreating into his pride. But when I called his name through the door, I heard a faint groan. That's when I broke the glass pane beside the knob and let myself in. He was on the floor, breathing hard, eyes half-lidded. Heat stroke, dehydration, maybe both. I called 911, stayed beside him until the ambulance came. His hand gripped mine once, weak but certain, before he passed out. At the hospital, they told me his blood pressure had dipped dangerously low. If I hadn't found him, he might not have woken up. I didn't cry. I sat in the waiting room, staring at the tiled floor, remembering the last time I had waited in a hospital hallway. It had been for my mother. The night she slipped away quietly, and he hadn't let me stay with her. I was 16 then, and he'd told me it was too painful for him. Like I didn't have my own grief to carry. When he woke up, he didn't look surprised to see me. He just asked if I had watered his cactus. That's how he was. Always skipping the hard part. Pretending emotions were puzzle pieces too complicated to solve. He was released 2 days later with a warning from the doctors to avoid stairs and heat. That's when he asked, not with words but with silence, if he could stay at my place. Just for a few weeks. Until he felt stronger. Until the heat wave passed. I should have said no. I wanted to say no. But my mother's voice, the one that lived in the back of my mind, whispered something softer. So I said yes. And that was the beginning of everything falling apart again, except this time, I was the one who held the key. He moved in with a duffel bag and 2 boxes of things I hadn't seen in years. One held tools he'd used when I was a child, coated in rust and silence. The other was filled with papers, receipts, and a photo of my mother tucked into an old book, her smile still caught in a time when things hadn't rotted between us. He said nothing about staying long. He just picked the smallest guest room on the 2nd floor and closed the door like he was locking away every apology he would never say. For the first 2 days, he barely spoke. Only asked where the sugar was and whether I still liked blueberry yogurt. I didn't answer. I just pushed a container across the counter. It wasn't the right flavor, but I let him believe it was. I thought I could live like that, 2 ghosts walking through a mansion like roommates in different timelines. But that illusion cracked on the 5th morning when I heard him pacing outside my office. I had a Zoom call with investors, the biggest one since I started freelancing as a digital brand strategist. I ignored him, focusing on my screen, but he opened the door anyway and stepped inside like it was still his house. He asked if I wanted to see something from his storage box. My voice sharpened, told him I was busy. He blinked, confused, then stepped back out slowly. The client on the other end raised an eyebrow and asked, "Is that your dad?" I smiled, tight and fake. No. Just someone I'm helping for a bit. It stung. How fast I'd said it. But it stung worse when I realized it was true. He was just someone. The next week, I came home to find he'd rearranged my living room. Said the couch would look better angled toward the window. He hadn't asked. He didn't think he needed to. I stared at the room in silence, remembering the last time he rearranged something of mine, when I was 15 and he threw out my bookshelf because he said it was clutter. That day, I'd cried behind a locked door while he blasted music in the kitchen like it was a celebration. This time I didn't cry. I just moved the couch back the next morning and didn't say a word. But he noticed. And that evening, I found the boxes in the guest room open, papers scattered like a storm had hit. At the top of the pile was a newspaper clipping, an article from when my mother won her final teaching award. Her smile stretched across the page, and right beneath it, a quote I'd never read before. "I do everything for my daughter. She's my legacy." I folded the paper carefully and tucked it into my drawer. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't shown me the article by accident. He wanted something. Not money. Not really. But something harder to give: validation, attention, redemption. And just when I thought I was imagining it, I got a call from a real estate agent.
Miss Alden.
Your father requested a viewing of your property on his behalf. Something about long-term transfer of ownership. I stopped breathing. He said, "What?" The agent sounded flustered, almost embarrassed. He mentioned that the house was being signed over to him for estate simplification. But we had no record. I thought it best to check. I thanked her, hung up, and sat very still. He hadn't asked. He hadn't even hinted. But in his mind, he was already planting flags in land he didn't own. That night, I confronted him. Asked him plainly why he told someone he was getting the house. He shrugged. Said something vague about trust and family, and how mothers would have wanted him to be secure. I asked if he remembered what he said to me at 18. If he remembered the night he kicked me out and told me to figure life out on my own. He looked away. Then he said, "You turned out all right." That was it. Not an apology. Not a memory. Just a lazy acknowledgement of survival, like I'd grown from concrete, and he thought that meant the soil had done its job. I told him the house wasn't his. Would never be his.
He didn't argue.
But the next day, he was gone. He left behind the cactus, the boxes, and a note in his handwriting. "If this is the only way I see you, then I'll leave you be. You were always hers more than mine." I should have felt relief. I should have felt peace. But what I felt instead was a different kind of emptiness, like something unfinished had walked out the door. I let a week pass.
2.
No word.
Until I saw the ambulance.
It was parked outside his old house next door. I saw the flashing lights from my bedroom window. My heart skipped, not from panic, but confusion. He wasn't supposed to be there anymore. I threw on a coat and ran outside. Neighbors were already gathering in whispers. The paramedics were carrying someone out on a stretcher. I pushed forward, eyes searching, until I saw the face. It wasn't him. It was a woman.
Young. Blonde.
Unconscious. And walking just behind the stretcher, pale and wide-eyed, was my father. He didn't notice me at first. He was too busy yelling into his phone, trying to explain to someone what had happened. Something about a tenant. Something about pills. Then he saw me and stopped cold. I walked up to him slowly. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. His shirt was wrinkled. His hand shook. "What's going on?" I asked quietly. He hesitated. "Then, she rents a room. It was supposed to be temporary. I didn't know she overdosed. I found her just now." His voice cracked, and for the first time in years, I saw fear in his eyes. Not for himself, but something else. Maybe guilt. Maybe helplessness. The next day, I did some digging. It turned out he had been renting out rooms for months. Quietly. Cash only.
No paperwork.
No questions. The girl, her name was Jamie, was barely 20. No emergency contact. No family in town. I visited her once in the hospital. She didn't wake up. But a nurse told me she had whispered something in her sleep the night before. One word. Dad. And suddenly it made sense. Why he had let her stay. Why he hadn't kicked her out. Why he looked the way he did watching her being wheeled into an ambulance. He wasn't just helping her. He was trying to fix something he'd broken in me. But she wasn't me. And that truth made my stomach twist. I confronted him again a few days later. Asked him why he took her in. He didn't dodge it this time. Said she reminded him of someone. Said he couldn't sleep at night thinking about all the ways he'd failed. Said he thought if he helped someone else, maybe it would mean something. Maybe it would undo something. But regret doesn't build bridges. It just drags you back to the edge and whispers what you lost. He stayed quiet for a long time after that. Mowed his lawn. Fixed up his porch. Waved at neighbors like nothing had happened. But every now and then, I'd catch him staring at my house again. Like he was waiting for a sign. For permission. For absolution. I didn't give it. But I didn't close the curtain either. Then came the letter. A thick envelope, hand-delivered by an attorney. My name written in clean cursive across the front. Inside, a legal notice. My father had filed to transfer his house, his only property, into my name. Free of cost. Effective immediately. The reason? He was being admitted to a long-term care facility. Early onset dementia.
Confirmed. Rapid progresión.
The signature at the bottom was shaky. But it was his. The ground didn't shift.
It shattered.
I stood there holding the papers, heart thudding, the weight of unfinished forgiveness pressing against my ribs. He hadn't asked for anything. Not a visit. Not money. Not even goodbye. Just left everything behind. The same man who once told me to figure it out was now forgetting everything himself. And in some twisted way, the universe had handed me the ending I never wanted, a chance to decide whether I'd hold his hand while he forgot the worst parts of what he did to me. And the best parts he'd never learned. The facility he was transferred to sat on a hill that overlooked a quiet lake. The kind of place brochures called serene and staff called secure. I didn't go the first week. Or the second. I told myself there were too many meetings, too much work, that I didn't have time to babysit a past that never grew up. But it wasn't the meetings. It wasn't work. It was fear, the fear of seeing him not remember me. Of walking into a room and realizing that the man who had shaped every crack in my life now couldn't even spell my name. That kind of forgetting felt crueler than abandonment. On the 15th day, I drove up there. The air was too clean, the hallways too quiet. The nurse at the desk smiled like she knew exactly who I was.
He talks about you, she said.
I blinked. What does he say? Her smile faded a little. That he's not sure if he made you up. My throat tightened, but I nodded and followed her down the corridor. His room was by a window. He was sitting in a recliner, a book upside down in his lap. He didn't look up when I entered. For a second, I almost turned around, told myself this was a mistake. But then he spoke, voice low. You wore red once, when your mom died.
I remember that.
I hadn't worn red.
Not that day.
But she had. My mother had worn a red scarf to the hospital, wrapped around her neck like armor. I stepped forward slowly. He didn't call me by name. Didn't ask why I was there. He just looked out the window and said, I thought being a father was something that would come naturally. Like breathing. But for me, it was like trying to hold water in a closed fist. He tapped the book gently, not realizing it was upside down. I wasn't built for it. I didn't answer, because part of me still wanted to scream. But another part, the part that had learned to survive grief like muscle memory, just watched him quietly. The visits became routine after that. Not frequent, but enough. I brought him fruit, books, once even a CD player with old jazz tracks he used to hum when he thought no one was listening. He never asked for anything. Never asked to be taken back to the house. It was as if a part of him had accepted the exile he once gave me. We were even now, I thought, balanced in our brokenness. But then came the knock on my door. The kind that changes everything. It was late, almost midnight. I opened it expecting a delivery mistake or a neighbor's emergency. Instead, I found a man in a dark windbreaker holding a folder. He introduced himself as David from the State Health Board. Said there had been some inconsistencies in the admissions paperwork for my father's care. I let him in. We sat at the kitchen table. He laid out documents I'd never seen. Different signatures. Different contact names. Someone had been using my father's name to access additional state benefits, funds that didn't match his actual condition, dates that contradicted his official medical records. Someone had been funneling money in his name. David asked if I had power of attorney. I said yes. He asked if I'd approved the long-term funding requests. I hadn't. He showed me one more page, an authorization form signed by a name I hadn't seen in years. Jamie. The same girl from the overdose. My father's tenant. My stomach dropped. She had disappeared after the hospital. Never returned. But apparently, she hadn't vanished. She'd just pivoted. A week later, I got another knock, this time from police. They were investigating elder fraud and needed access to my father's financial records. I complied, still trying to piece it together. They said Jamie had been working with a small ring of fake caregivers, taking in lonely old men with property, gaining access to accounts, and slowly draining them. My father had been a perfect target, aging, alone, regretful. He probably thought helping her was atonement. She had made him believe he was needed. That was her game. Emotional currency first. Real currency second. The twist? She had filed paperwork claiming she was his stepdaughter. Listed herself as a legal dependent, forged medical documents, redirected payments to shell accounts. The reason she had collapsed in his house that night wasn't an accident. It was her cover slipping. She'd taken something, yes, but the overdose was staged, timed to the minute. So when help arrived, they'd find her vulnerable, innocent. But she hadn't accounted for me. For the neighbor next door, who'd come too soon. I drove to the facility the next morning, hands tight on the wheel. When I walked into his room, he looked up.
Confused.
But this time he tried. You're her. I nodded. I am. I told him what they'd found. He blinked once slowly. Then said, she told me you didn't care. That you moved away. I asked if he believed her. He didn't answer. But the way he slumped forward, the way his fingers twitched at the hem of the blanket, I knew. He had wanted to.
I got a call later that week.
The girl, Jamie, had been found in Nevada under a different name. She was in custody. Would face trial. But what struck me wasn't her crimes. It was the final detail the detective shared before hanging up. When arrested, she had a photo in her wallet. A printout. Blurry. Faded.
It was of me.
Standing in front of the mansion. Smiling. Holding a mug of tea on my porch. She had been watching us. She had known who I was from the start. She hadn't just targeted my father. She had targeted me. And in some twisted way, it worked. I had paid the price, cleaned the wounds, rebuilt the walls. And all the while, she had been playing memory against me. Feeding his regret. Rewriting the story so that she was the good daughter. The one who stayed. Who forgave. Who cared. I stood in the center of my living room that night, every light off except one. I stared at the house next door. Empty now. Quiet.
Mine, tenikali.
A shell filled with echoes I didn't ask for. I had spent years building a life to prove something, that I wasn't the girl he pushed away, that I was more than discarded. And yet here I was, caught in a legacy I didn't want, protecting a man who didn't remember why I left, from a girl who pretended I never existed. I didn't sleep that night. The next day I packed. Not to run, but to leave something behind. My father's house. The one he gave me. I put it up for auction, silently, privately. I donated the proceeds to a foundation for abused youth aging out of foster care.
No annunciament.
No press. I changed the locks on my own house, rebuilt my boundaries, and I scheduled my visits to the facility carefully. Twice a month. No more. No less. It was enough to be present, not consumed. And then, just when I thought the final twist had been played, a letter arrived. No return address. Just one sentence on thick cream paper, written in shaky ink. You were always the real daughter. I just wore her name. Signed, Jamie. A postmark from jail. And with that, the story twisted once again because sometimes the villains want forgiveness, too. But not all stories have room for that.
Some endings don't come with a bow.
Some come with a door quietly closed and locked. The letter from Jamie sat in my drawer for 3 weeks before I touched it again. Not because I was afraid, but because some words feel like poison. Slow, invisible, soaking into you even when you swear you're protected. I kept rereading that one line. You were always the real daughter. I just wore her name. The handwriting was rushed, but the words weren't careless. She had meant them. And that's what unsettled me. It wasn't a threat. It was a confession. But confessions don't clean wounds. They just open them again. I tried to forget it. Focused on work. Declined 2 of my scheduled visits to my father. But then came the call from the facility director. He's begun talking to himself, she said. Whispering like someone's there. Keeps repeating a name, Jamie. We thought you should know. I asked if he remembered who Jamie was. She hesitated, then said softly, he thinks she's his daughter. I drove over the next morning, against my better judgment. I told myself it was to check on him. But the truth was, I needed to know what pieces of his memory still had my name on them. When I stepped into the room, he was staring at the corner like someone was sitting there. I said hello. He turned slowly. Is she mad? He asked. My chest tightened.
Who?
He gestured vaguely. Jamie. She left the water running again. My breath caught. I asked him if he remembered my name. He blinked. His lips moved, but nothing came out. The nurse later told me that his dementia had entered a new stage. False memories were forming. He was weaving people together, stitching old guilt into new identities. Jamie had replaced me in his mind not as an imposter, but as a cleaner version of the daughter he couldn't fully face. That realization hurt more than rejection. It was erasure. That night, I pulled out the letter again. Read it fully, slowly. There was something strange about the paper. The ink had bled slightly in one corner, as if it had been wet, but not water. Something stickier. On impulse, I held the page up to the light. There, almost invisible, imprinted from the other side, were faint outlines of a second note written over the first, then pressed and erased. I held it up again at a sharper angle. 6 words appeared, nearly impossible to see. Ask the lawyer. Look at April. My hands went cold. April? What happened in April? I pulled up my email archives, searched dates, messages, anything. There was nothing unusual from April until I checked the legal correspondence tied to my father's property transfer. One document, dated April 3rd, had a file name mismatch, titled Medical Clearance but saved as Power Amend Final. I opened it. It was a disguised power of attorney, one I had never signed. At the bottom, my digital signature. Forged. Filed by someone with access to his accounts and history. I called my lawyer instantly. He confirmed it wasn't standard protocol. The document had slipped through, due to an internal system migration. It had granted Jamie full decision-making power over medical and financial matters for a 21-day window, just long enough to move assets, redirect payments, and create a paper trail that pointed to her as next of kin. It wasn't just fraud. It was identity laundering. She had tried to become illegally, just for a short time. Long enough to make it seem real. And if I hadn't intercepted her act that night, she collapsed. If I hadn't shown up too early, she might have succeeded. The thought chilled me. But it also ignited something. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I needed answers. The real ones. I contacted the detective on her case and asked to visit the county holding center. He paused. Are you sure? He asked. She's unpredictable. I said I didn't care. The room was gray and too cold. She walked in wearing the orange jumpsuit like it was a designer cut. No makeup, but still smirking. She sat, leaned back and said, "Took you long enough. I didn't waste time." I slid the copy of her note across the table. You told me to ask the lawyer. Why? Her eyes didn't waver. Because I was never trying to take your father from you. I blinked. What? She leaned in. He was never the real target. You were. My heart slammed. She explained calmly, with the ease of someone telling a bedtime story, that the moment she saw me, successful, alone, the daughter of a man who once threw her a sandwich on the porch while tossing her mother's name like trash, she realized something. We weren't that different, she said. But you had the resources. The name. The smile people trust. And I thought, What if I just slipped into your shadow? Wore it long enough to reshape my life. She didn't want my father. She wanted my blueprint. Because he had pushed me out, I'd built something valuable in exile. And Jamie, drifting through systems and shelters, saw that life and thought she could crawl into it and make it fit. But shadows only stretch so far. Before I left, I asked her why she warned me at all. She shrugged. Because you came back for him when I wouldn't have. That line stayed with me. Weeks passed. I started locking my gates, changing my passwords, updating my legal files. I secured my business, hired someone to monitor any name misuse. I should have felt safer. But I didn't feel whole. Then one morning, a package arrived. No return label. Inside, a USB drive. I scanned it with precautions. One file. A video. It was security footage. My front yard. Me, years ago, barely 19, dragging a duffel to the curb. A neighbor must have caught it by accident.
But what stood out wasn't me. It was the door behind me. The one he slammed.
Except in the footage, he didn't close it instantly. He watched from the frame for over a minute. Watched me cry. Watched me hesitate. Watched me walk away. And didn't move. Not once. The clip ended there. It shouldn't have mattered. But it did. Because sometimes you don't need apologies. You need proof. That they saw you, even if they pretended they didn't. I closed the laptop and sat in silence. Outside, the mansion glowed golden under the morning light. I looked toward the facility address again. Then back at the USB. There were more stories in this family than I could ever untangle. But for once, they were mine to hold, not to carry. And not to be erased from. 3 weeks after the video, the state dropped the fraud case against Jamie, not because she was innocent, but because she flipped. She gave them the name of someone else. A man. Older. Quiet. He ran the back end of the operation, creating forged legal forms, false witness statements, even building temporary online profiles to make it look like daughters and sons existed where they didn't. She wasn't the mastermind. She was a foot soldier. A mimic. An empty outline waiting to be filled by someone else's past. They arrested him in Arizona. He had over 20 aliases. 12 fake eldercare clients. And when they asked about my father, he reportedly said, "Oh, the one with the daughter, who actually showed up? That one ruined everything." I don't know why that shook me more than anything. Maybe because after everything, that's what stood out to them. Not the mansion, not the money, not the forged papers, but the fact that I came back. I told myself that was the end of it. But trauma doesn't end. It folds. Layers itself deep into the cracks of your quietest moments. It shows up when you're brushing your teeth or locking the door or watching an old video of your mother smiling at a picnic. I tried to keep moving. Expanded my business. Hired 2 new team members. Spoke at a mentorship conference. Smiled through the applause. But even then, something was tugging in my gut. It wasn't done. There was still one thing I hadn't done.
So, I went back.
To the facility. It had been 6 weeks since my last visit. The staff said he'd gotten quieter. Less engaged. They suspected the dementia had reached its later stages. I walked into his room expecting the same stillness, soft breathing, the vacant fog. But he looked up as I entered. And this time, he spoke my name. Not a whisper. Not a guess.
Full. Clear.
Alara. I froze. He hadn't said my name right in months. Then he smiled, crooked and small, and said, "You were always better than me." I sat down, unsure how to breathe. He kept going. "I see it now. How you survived me. How you didn't let my silence define you." His voice cracked just slightly. "You didn't build a life to prove anything. You built it because you refused to be small." I didn't speak. Just stared. He looked toward the window. I thought forgetting would be the worst part. But it's not. It's remembering too late. A nurse came in then to adjust his medication, and the moment folded into background noise. But it stayed with me, his words, the weight in them. He hadn't said sorry. But this wasn't a man who ever learned to say that. It was the closest he could come. And in some twisted way, it was enough. That night, I pulled out the old file box he left behind. It was dusty now, untouched for months. Inside were his papers, faded receipts, and one sealed envelope addressed to my mother. I hadn't noticed it before. I opened it slowly, the paper thin as skin. Inside was a handwritten letter. He had written it 3 days after she died. I don't know how to do this without you. She looks just like you, but I keep failing her anyway. She asks things I don't know how to answer. And when she cries, it sounds like the word leave. I want to do better, but every time I try, I see her eyes and I freeze. I think she sees it too. I think she knows I'm scared of the version of me that shows up when you're not around. I folded the letter carefully. All these years, I thought he hated me. But maybe what he hated was who he became after she was gone. Still, understanding is not the same as healing. The next day, I listed the mansion. The one I had bought for myself. The one he had moved into, if only symbolically, by the way he haunted my life. I didn't want to live beside memories anymore. I wanted fresh air. Space. But not before one last thing. I took him out. Just once. Signed the forms. Got the wheelchair. Drove him to the bluff where my mother used to take me on Sundays. The wind was sharp. The sea below sounded like a warning, or maybe a lullaby. He didn't say much. But as we sat there, he reached for my hand. Held it. Lightly. And then he said, "She would have been proud of you." I wasn't. Not because you failed. But because I did. It was the only time I saw him cry. 2 weeks later, he passed in his sleep. No complications. No pain. Just gone. The funeral was small. I didn't invite many. Just a few neighbors who remembered his good days. One nurse from the home. The director, who said he always smiled more when I was there, even when he didn't remember why. I didn't cry during the service. I cried afterward, when I stood in front of the mansion's empty fireplace, holding the last thing he left behind. A key. Not labeled. Not explained. But I knew what it was for. A small metal box behind the garage in his house. The one he used to tell me was for old junk. I opened it. Inside were photos. Dozens. Of me. Graduations. Jobs. Smiles stolen from social media. Articles clipped from local papers. Printouts of my website. All tagged with little yellow notes. Investor panel. First contract. New logo. He had been watching, not just from the window, but through every stage of my life. I sat down on the dusty floor. Photos spread around me like memories finally given breath. And I wept. Not for him, but for the girl I used to be. The one who thought being kicked out meant she was disposable. The one who fought for space in a world that wanted her small. The one who, without knowing, became everything she needed. The sale closed in 30 days. I moved to a quiet neighborhood 3 states over. Started a mentorship center. Nothing fancy. Just a small building where I helped young women who had been erased or replaced or silenced. They asked me why I called it Shadowlight. I told them, because that's what we are. The ones who rise even after being cast aside. The ones who turn the dark into direction. Sometimes I still dream of him, not as he was, but as he tried to be. In the dream, we're standing side by side, watching the ocean. No words, just wind. And I'm not waiting for him to speak. Because finally, I don't need him to. I already became the woman I was waiting for.